Chapter 23. Well, all day him and the king was hard at it, rigging up a stage and a curtain and a row of candles for footlights, and that night the house was jam full of men in no time. When the place couldn't hold no more, the Duke, he quit tending door, and went around the back way, and come onto the stage and stood up before the curtain and made a little speech, and praised up this tragedy, and said it was the most thrillingest one that ever was. And so he went on a-bragging about the tragedy, and about Edmund Kean the elder, which was to play the main principal part in it. And at last, when he'd got everybody's expectations up high enough, he rolled up the curtain, and the next minute the king come a-prancing out on all fours, naked, and he was painted all over, rings streaked and striped all sorts of colors, as splendid as a rainbow. But never mind the rest of his outfit, it was just wild, but it was awful funny. The people most killed themselves laughing, and when the king got done caperin' and capered off behind the scenes, they roared and clapped and stormed and haw-hawed till he come back and done it over again, and after that they made him do it another time. Well, it would make a cow laugh to see the shines that old idiot cut. Then the Duke he lets the curtain down and bows to the people and says the great tragedy will be performed only 2 nights more, on accounts of pressin' London engagements, where the seats is all sold already for it in Drury Lane. And then he makes them another deep bow and says if he has succeeded in pleasing them and instructing them, he will be deeply obleeged if they will mention it to their friends and get them to come and see it. 20 people sings out, "What, is it over? Is that all?" The Duke says yes. Then there was a fine time. Everybody sings out, "Sold!" and rose up mad and was a-goin' for that stage and them tragedians. But a big, fine-looking man jumps up on a bench and shouts, "Hold on! Just a word, gentlemen." They stop to listen. "We are sold, mighty badly sold, but we don't want to be the laughin' stock of this whole town, I reckon, and never hear the last of this thing as long as we live. No, what we want is to go out of here quiet and talk this show up and sell the rest of the town. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Ain't that sensible?" "You bet it is. The judge is right," everybody sings out. "All right, then. Not a word about any sell. Go along home and advise everybody to come and see the tragedy." Next day you couldn't hear nothin' around that town but about how splendid that show was. House was jammed again that night, and we sold this crowd the same way. When me and the king and the Duke got home to the raft, we all had a supper, and by and by, about midnight, they made Jim and me back her out and float her down the middle of the river, and fetch her in and hide her about 2 mile below town. The third night the house was crammed again, and they warn't newcomers this time, but people that was at the show the other 2 nights. I stood by the Duke at the door, and I see that every man that went in had his pockets bulgin' or something muffled up under his coat, and I see it weren't no perfumery neither, not by a long sight. I smelt sickly eggs by the barrel, and rotten cabbages and such things, and if I know the signs of a dead cat bein' around, and I bet I do, there was 64 of them went in. I shoved in there for a minute, but it was too various for me. I couldn't stand it. Well, when the place couldn't hold no more people, the Duke he give a fella a quarter and told him to tend door for a minute, and then he started around for the stage door, I after him. But the minute we turned the corner and was in the dark, he says, "Walk fast now, till you get away from the houses, and then shin for the raft like the dickens was after you." I done it, and he done the same. We struck the raft at the same time, and in less 'n 2 seconds we was glidin' downstream, all dark and still, and edgin' towards the middle of the river, nobody sayin' a word. I reckon the poor king was in for a gaudy time of it with the audience, but nothin' of the sort. Pretty soon he crawls out from under the wigwam and says, Well, how'd the old thing pan out this time, Duke?" "He hadn't been uptown at all. We never showed a light till we was about 10 mile below the village. Then we lit up and had a supper, and the king and the duke fairly laughed their bones loose over the way they'd served them people. The duke says, 'Greenhorns, flatheads, I knew the first house would keep mum and let the rest of the town get roped in, and I knew they'd lay for us the third night, and consider it was their turn now. Well, it is their turn, and I'd give something to know how much they'd take for it. I would just like to know how they're putting in their opportunity. They can turn it into a picnic if they want to. They brought plenty provisions.' Them rapscallions took in $465 in that 3 nights. I never seen money hauled in by the wagon load like that before. By and by, when they was sleepin' and snoring, Jim says, 'Don't it surprise you, the way them kings carries on, Huck?' 'No,' I says, 'it don't.' 'Why don't it, Huck?' 'Well, it don't because it's in the breed. I reckon they're all alike.' 'But, Huck, these kings of ourn is reg'lar rapscallions. That's just what they is. They's reg'lar rapscallions.' 'Well, that's what I'm a-sayin'. All kings is mostly rapscallions, as fur as I can make out.' 'Is that so?' 'You read about them once, you'll see. Look at Henry the Eighth. This'n is a Sunday school superintendent to him. And look at Charles Second, and Louis 14, and Louis 15, and James Second, and Edward Second, and Richard Third, and 40 more, besides all them Saxton heptarchies that used to rip around so in old times and raise Cain. My, you ought to see old Henry the Eighth when he was in bloom. He was a blossom. He used to marry a new wife every day and chop off her head next morning, and he would do it just as indifferent as if he was ordering up eggs. 'Fetch up Nell Gwynn,' he says. They fetch her up. Next morning, 'Chop off her head,' and they chop it off. 'Fetch up Jane Shore,' he says, and up she comes. Next morning, 'Chop off her head,' and they chop it off. 'Ring up Fair Rosamond.' Fair Rosamond answers the bell. Next morning, 'Chop off her head,' and he made every one of them tell him a tale every night, and he kept that up till he had hogged 1,001 tales that way, and then he put them all in a book, and called it Doomsday Book, which was a good name, and stated the case. You don't know kings, Jim, but I know them, and this old rip of ourn is one of the cleanest I've struck in history. Well, Henry, he takes a notion he wants to get up some trouble with this country. How does he go at it? Give notice? Give a country a show? No. All of a sudden, he heaves all the tea in Boston Harbor overboard, and whacks out a Declaration of Independence, and dares them to come on. That was his style. He never give anybody a chance. He had suspicions of his father, the Duke of Wellington. Well, what did he do? Ask him to show up? No. Drownded him in a butt of Mamsie, like a cat. Suppose people left money laying around where he was. What did he do? He collared it. Suppose he contracted to do a thing and you paid him and didn't sit down there and see that he done it. What did he do? He always done the other thing. Suppose he opened his mouth. What then? If he didn't shut it up powerful quick, he'd lose a lie every time. That's a kind of a bug, Henry was, and if we'd had him along 'stead of our kings, he'd have fooled that town a heap worse than ourn done. I don't say that ourn is lambs, because they ain't, when you come right down to the cold facts, but they ain't nothing to that old ram anyway. All I say is, kings is kings, and you got to make allowances. Take them all round, they're a mighty ornery lot. It's the way they're raised. But this one do smell so like donation, Huck. Well, they all do, Jim. We can't help the way a king smells. History don't tell no way. Now, the Duke, he's a tolerable likely man in some ways. Yes, the Duke's different, but not very different. This one's a middlin' hard lot for a duke. When he's drunk, there ain't no near-sighted man could tell him from a king. Well, anyways, I don't hanker for no more'n 'em, Hook. These is all I can stand. It's the way I feel too, Jim. But we've got them on our hands, and we got to remember what they are and make allowances. Sometimes I wish we could hear of a country that's out of kings. What was the use to tell Jim these warn't real kings and dukes? It wouldn't have done no good, and besides, it was just as I said. You couldn't tell them from the real kind. I went to sleep, and Jim didn't call me when it was my turn. He often done that. When I waked up, just at daybreak, he was sittin' there with his head down betwixt his knees, moanin' and mournin' to himself. I didn't take notice nor let on. I knowed what it was about. He was thinkin' about his wife and his children away up yonder, and he was low and homesick, because he hadn't ever been away from home before in his life, and I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks does for their'n. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He was often moanin' and mournin' that way nights when he judged I was asleep, and sayin', "Po' little Elizabeth, po' little Johnny, it's mighty hard. I s'pect I ain't ever gwine to see you no mo', no mo'." He was a mighty good nigger, Jim was. But this time I somehow got to talkin' to him about his wife and young ones, and by he says, "What makes me feel so bad dis time is because I hear somepin over yonder on de bank like a whack or a slam, while ago, and it mind me er de time I treat my little Elizabeth so ornery. She warn't only 'bout 4 year old, and she took de scarlet fever, and had a powerful rough spell, but she got well, and one day she was a-standin' round, and I says to her, I says, 'Shut de door.' She never done it, just stood dere, kinder smilin' up at me. It made me mad, and I says again, mighty loud, I says, 'Don't you hear me? Shut de door.' She just stood the same way, kinder smilin' up. I was a-bilin'. I says, 'I lay I make you mine.' And wid dat I fetch her a slap side de head dat sent her a-sprawlin'. Then I went into de other room, and was gone 'bout 10 minutes, and when I come back, dere was dat door standin' open yit, and dat child standin' most right in it, a-lookin' down and mournin', and de tears runnin' down. My, but I was mad. I was a-gwine for de child, but just den, it was a door dat opened innards. Just den, 'long come de wind and slam it to behind de child. Kerblam! And my land, de child never move. My breath most hop outer me, and I feel so, I don't know how I feel. I crope out all a-tremblin', and crope around and open de door easy and slow, and poke my head in behind de child, soft and still, and all of a sudden I says, 'Pow!' just as loud as I could yell. She never budge. Oh, Huck, I bust out a-cryin' and grab her up in my arms, and say, 'Oh, de po' little thing. De Lord God Almighty forgive po' old Jim, 'cause he never goin' to forgive himself as long's he live.' Oh, she was plumb deaf and dumb, Huck, plumb deaf and dumb, and I'd been a-treatin' her so." End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24. Next day, towards night, we laid up under a little willow towhead out in the middle, where there was a village on each side of the river, and the Duke and the King begun to lay out a plan for working them towns. Jim, he spoke to the Duke, and said he hoped it wouldn't take but a few hours, because it got mighty heavy and tiresome to him when he had to lay all day in the wigwam, tied with the rope. You see, when we left him all alone we had to tie him, because if anybody happened on to him all by himself, and not tied, it wouldn't look much like he was a runaway nigger, you know. So the Duke said it was kind of hard to have to lay roped all day, and he'd cipher out some way to get around it. He was uncommon bright, the Duke was, and he soon struck it. he dressed Jim up in the King Lear's outfit. It was a long curtain calico gown, and a white horsehair wig and whiskers, and then he took his theater paint and painted Jim's face and hands and ears and neck all over a dead, dull, solid blue, like a man that's been drownded 9 days. Blamed if he warn't the horriblest-looking outrage I ever see. Then the Duke took and wrote out a sign on a shingle, so, "Sick Arab, but harmless when not out o' his head." And he nailed that shingle to a lath, and stood the lath up 4 or 5 foot in front of the wigwam. Jim was satisfied. He said it was a sight better than lying tied a couple of years every day, and trembling all over every time there was a sound. The Duke told him to make himself free and easy, and if anybody ever come meddling round, he must hop out of the wigwam and carry on a little, and fetch a howl or two like a wild beast, and he reckoned they would light out and leave him alone. Which was sound enough judgment, but you take the average man, and he wouldn't wait for him to howl. Why, he didn't only look like he was dead, he looked considerable more than that. These rapscallions wanted to try the Nonsuch again, because there was so much money in it, but they judged it wouldn't be safe, because maybe the news might have worked along down by this time. They couldn't hit no project that suited exactly, so at last the Duke said he reckoned he'd lay off and work his brains an hour or two, and see if he couldn't put up something on the Arkansas village. And the King, he allowed he would drop over to the other village without any plan, but just trust in Providence to lead him the profitable way, meaning the devil, I reckon. We had all bought store clothes where we stopped last, and now the King put his'n on, and he told me to put mine on. I done it, of course. The King's duds was all black, and he did look real swell and starchy. I never knowed how clothes could change a body before. Why, before, he looked like the orneriest old rip that ever was. But now, when he'd take off his new white beaver and make a bow and do a smile, he looked that grand and good and pious that you'd say he had walked right out of the ark, and maybe was old Leviticus himself. Jim cleaned up the canoe, and I got my paddle ready. There's a big steamboat layin' at the shore way up under the point, about 3 mile above the town. Been there a couple of hours, takin' on freight. Says the King, "See how I'm dressed? I reckon maybe I better arrive down from St. Louis or Cincinnati, or some other big place. Go for the steamboat, Huckleberry. We'll come down to the village on her." I didn't have to be ordered twice to go and take a steamboat ride. I fetched the shore a half a mile above the village, and then went scootin' along the bluff bank in the easy water. Pretty soon we come to a nice, innocent-looking young country Jake, settin' on a log swabbing the sweat off of his face, for it was powerful warm weather, and he had a couple of big carpet-bags by him. "Run her nose in shore," says the King. I done it. "Where you bound for, young man?" "For the steamboat going to Orleans." "Get aboard," says the King. "Hold on a minute, my servant'll help you with them bags. Jump out and help the gentleman, Adolphus." Meaning me, I guess. I done so, and then we all three started on again. The young chap was mighty thankful, said it was tough work toting his baggage, such weather. He asked the King where he was going, and the King told him he'd come down the river and landed at the other village this morning, and now he was going up a few mile to see an old friend on a farm up there. The young fella says, "When I first see you, I says to myself, it's Mr. Wilkes, sure, and he come mighty near getting here in time. But then I says, no, I reckon it ain't him, or else he wouldn't be paddling up the river. You ain't him, are you?" "No, my name's Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett, Reverend Alexander Blodgett. I suppose I must say as I'm one of the Lord's poor servants, but still I'm just as able to be sorry for Mr. Wilkes for not arriving in time, all the same, if he's missed anything by it, which I hope he hasn't." "Well, he didn't miss any property by it, because he'll get that all right, but he's missed seeing his brother Peter die, which he mayn't mind, nobody can tell as to that, but his brother would have give anything in this world to see him before he died, Never talked about nothing else all these 3 weeks. Hadn't seen him since they was boys together. I hadn't seen his brother William at all. That's the deaf and dumb one. William ain't more than 30 or 35. Peter and George were the only ones that come out here. George was the married brother. Him and his wife both died last year. Harvey and William's the only ones that's left now, and as I was saying, they haven't got here in time. Did anybody send 'em word? Oh, yes, a month or 2 ago, when Peter was first took, 'cause Peter said then that he sorter felt like he warn't going to get well this time. You see, he was pretty old, and George's girls was too young to be much company for him, except Mary Jane, the red-headed one, and so he was kinder lonesome after George and his wife died, and didn't seem to care much to live. He most desperately wanted to see Harvey, and William too, for that matter, 'cause he was one of them kind that can't bear to make a will. He left a letter behind for Harvey and said he'd told him in it where his money was hid, and how he wanted the rest of the property divided up so George's girls would be all right, for George didn't leave nothin', and that letter was all they could get him to put a pen to. Why do you reckon Harvey don't come? Where does he live? Oh, he lives in England. Sheffield, preaches there. Hasn't ever been in this country. He hasn't had any too much time. And besides, he mightn't have got the letter at all, you know. Too bad, too bad. He couldn't have lived to see his brothers, poor soul. You going to Orleans, you say? Yes, but that ain't only a part of it. I'm going in a ship next Wednesday for Rio Janeiro, where my uncle lives. It's a pretty long journey, but it'll be lovely. Wished I was a-going. Is Mary Jane the oldest? How old is the others? Mary Jane's 19, Susan's 15, and Joanna's about 14. That's the one that gives herself to good works, and has a hare lip. Poor things, to be left alone in the cold world so. Well, they could be worse off. Old Peter had friends, and they ain't going to let them come to no harm. There's Hobson, the Baptist preacher, and Deacon Lot Hovey, and Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackleford, and Levi Bell, the lawyer, and Dr. Robinson, and their wives, and the widow Bartley, and, well, there's a lot of them, but these are the ones that Peter was thickest with, and used to write about sometimes, when he wrote home. So Harvey'll know where to look for friends when he gets here. Well, the old man went on asking questions till he just fairly emptied that young fella. Blamed if he didn't inquire about everybody and everything in that blessed town, and all about the Wilkses, and about Peter's business, which was a tanner, and about George's, which was a carpenter, and about Harvey's, which was a dissenterin' minister, and so on and so on. Then he says, "What did you want to walk all the way up to the steamboat for?" "Because she's a big Orleans boat, and I was afeard she mightn't stop there. When they're deep they won't stop for a hail. A Cincinnati boat will, but this is a St. Louis one." "Was Peter Wilkes well off?" "Oh, yes, pretty well off. He had houses and land, and it's reckoned he left 3,000 or 4,000 in cash, hid up somewheres." "When did you say he died?" "I didn't say, but it was last night." "Funeral tomorrow, likely?" "Yes, about the middle of the day." "Well, it's all terrible sad, but we've all got to go one time or another, so what we want to do is to be prepared, then we're all right." "Yes, sir, it's the best way. Ma used to always say that." When we struck the boat, she was about done loadin', and pretty soon she got off. The king never said nothin' about goin' aboard, so I lost my ride after all. When the boat was gone, the king made me paddle up another mile to a lonesome place, and then he got ashore and says, "Now hustle back right off, and fetch the Duke up here, and the new carpet-bags, and if he's gone over to the other side, go over there and get him, and tell him to get himself up regardless. Shove along now." I see what he was up to, but I never said nothin', of course. When I got back with the Duke, we hid the canoe, and then they set down on a log, and the king told him everything, just like the young fella had said it, every last word of it. And all the time he was doing it, he tried to talk like an Englishman, and he done it pretty well, too, for a slouch. I can't imitate him, so I ain't a-goin' to try to, but he really done it pretty good. Then he says, "How were you on the deaf and dumb, Bilgewater?" The Duke said leave him alone for that, said he had played a deaf and dumb person before, on the histronic boards. So then they waited for a steamboat. About the middle of the afternoon a couple of little boats come along, but they didn't come from high enough up the river. But at last there was a big one, and they hailed her. She sent out for her yawl, and we went aboard. And she was from Cincinnati, and when they found we only wanted to go 4 or 5 miles, they was booming mad and gave us a cussin', and said they wouldn't land us. But the king was calm. He says, "If gentlemen can afford to pay $1 a mile apiece to be took on and put off in a yawl, a steamboat can afford to carry 'em, can't it?" So they softened down and said it was all right, and when we got to the village they yawled us ashore. About 24 men flocked down where they see the yawl a-comin', and when the king says, "Can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?" they give a glance at one another and nodded their heads, as much as to say, "What did I tell you?" Then one of them says, kind of soft and gentle, "I'm sorry, sir, but the best we can do is tell you where he did live yesterday evening." Sudden as winkin', the ornery old creature went into smash and fell up against the man and put his chin on his shoulder and cried down his back and says, "Alas, alas, our poor brother gone, and we never got to see him. Oh, it's too hard." Then he turns around, blubberin', and makes a lot of idiotic signs to the Duke on his hands, and blamed if he didn't drop a carpet-bag and bust out a-cryin'. If they warn't the beatin'est lot, them 2 frauds, that ever I struck. Well, the men gathered around and sympathized with them, and said all sorts of kind things to them, and carried their carpet-bags up the hill for them and let them lean on them and cry, and told the king all about his brother's last moments, and the king, he told it all over again on his hands to the Duke, and both of them took on about that dead tanner like they'd lost the 12 disciples. Well, if ever I struck anything like it, I'm a nigger. It was enough to make a body ashamed of the human race. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25. The news was all over town in 2 minutes, and you could see the people tearing down on the run from every which way, some of them putting on their coats as they come. Pretty soon we was in the middle of a crowd, and the noise of the trampin' was like a soldier march. The windows and dooryards was full, and every minute somebody would say over a fence, "Is it them?" And somebody trotting along with the gang would answer back and say, "You bet it is." When we got to the house, the street in front of it was packed, and the 3 girls was standing in the door. Mary Jane was red-headed, but that don't make no difference. She was most awful beautiful, and her face and her eyes was all lit up like glory, she was so glad her uncles had come. The king, he spread his arms, and Mary Jane, she jumped for them, and the hare-lip jumped for the Duke, and there they had it. Everybody most, leastways women, cried for joy to see them meet again at last and have such good times. Then the king, he hunched the Duke private. I see him do it. And then he looked around and see the coffin over in the corner on 2 chairs. So then him and the Duke, with a hand across each other's shoulder and the other hand to their eyes, walked slow and solemn over there, everybody dropping back to give them room, and all the talk and noise stoppin', people sayin' "Shh," and all the men taking their hats off and drooping their heads, so you could 'a' heard a pin fall. And when they got there, they bent over and looked in the coffin and took one sight, and then they bust out a-cryin' so you could 'a' heard them to Orleans most, and then they put their arms round each other's necks and hung their chins over each other's shoulders, and then for 3 minutes, or maybe 4, I never see 2 men leak the way they done. And mind you, everybody was doing the same, and the place was that damp I never see anything like it. Then one of them got on one side of the coffin, and the other on the other side, and they kneeled down and rested their foreheads on the coffin, and let on to pray all to themselves. Well, when it come to that, it worked the crowd like you never see anything like it, and everybody broke down and went to sobbing right out loud. The poor girls, too, and every woman nearly went up to the girls without saying a word and kissed them, solemn on the forehead, and then put their hand on their head and looked up towards the sky with the tears running down, and then busted out and went off sobbing and swabbing, and give the next woman a show. I never see anything so disgusting. Well, by and by, the king he gets up and comes forward a little, and works himself up and slobbers out a speech all full of tears and flapdoodle about its being a sore trial for him and his poor brother to lose the diseased, and to miss seeing diseased alive after the long journey of 4,000 mile, but it's a trial that's sweetened and sanctified to us by this dear sympathy and these holy tears, and so he thanks them out of his heart and out of his brother's heart, because out of their mouths they can't, words being too weak and cold, and all that kind of rotten slush, till it was just sickening, and then he blubbers out a pious goody-goody amen, and turns himself loose and goes to crying fit to bust. And the minute the words were out of his mouth, somebody over in the crowd struck up the doxologer, and everybody joined in with all their might, and it just warmed you up and made you feel as good as church letting out. Music is a good thing, and after all that soul butter and hogwash, I never see it freshen up things so, and sound so honest and bully. Then the king begins to work his jaw again, and says how him and his nieces would be glad if a few of the main principal friends of the family would take supper here with them this evening, and help set up with the ashes of the diseased, and says if his poor brother layin' yonder could speak, he knows who he would name, for they was names that was very dear to him, and mentioned often in his letters, and so he will name the same, to wit, as follows, viz., Reverend Mr. Hobson, and Deacon Lot Hovey, and Mr. Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackleford, and Levi Bell, and Dr. Robinson, and their wives, and the widow Bartley. Reverend Hobson and Dr. Robinson was down to the end of the town a-hunting together. That is, I mean the doctor was shipping a sick man to the other world, and the preacher was p'inting him right. Lawyer Bell was away up to Louisville on business, but the rest was on hand, so they all come and shook hands with the king and thanked him and talked to him, and then they shook hands with the duke and didn't say nothin', but just kept a-smilin' and bobbing their heads like a passel of sapheads, whilst he made all sorts of signs with his hands and said goo-goo, goo-goo-goo all the time, like a baby that can't talk. So the king he blattered on and managed to inquire about pretty much everybody and dog in town by his name, and mentioned all sorts of little things that happened one time or another in the town, or to George's family, or to Peter, and he always let on that Peter wrote him the things, but that was a lie. He got every blessed one of them out of that young flathead that we canoed up to the steamboat. Then Mary Jane, she fetched the letter her father left behind, and the king he read it out loud and cried over it. It give the dwellin'-house and $3,000 gold to the girls, and it give the tan-yard, which was doing a good business, along with some other houses and land, worth about $7,000, and $3,000 in gold to Harvey and William, and told where the $6,000 cash was hid down cellar. So these two frauds said they'd go and fetch it up and have everything square and above board, and told me to come with a candle. We shut the cellar door behind us, and when they found the bag, they spilt it out on the floor, and it was a lovely sight, all them yaller boys. My, the way the king's eyes did shine! He slaps the duke on the shoulder and says, "Oh, this ain't bully nor nothin'. Oh, no, I reckon not. Why, Billy, it beats the Nonsuch, don't it?" The duke allowed it did. They pawed the yaller boys, and sifted them through their fingers and let them jingle down on the floor, and the king says, "It ain't no use talkin', bein' brothers to a rich dead man, and representatives of furrin heirs that's got left is the line for you and me, Bilge. This yer comes a trustin' to Providence. It's the best way in the long run. I've tried 'em all, and there ain't no better way." Most everybody would have been satisfied with the pile, and took it on trust. But no, they must count it. So they counts it, and it comes out $415 short. Says the king, "Darn him, I wonder what he done with that $415. They worried over that a while and ransacked all around for it. Then the Duke says, "Well, he was a pretty sick man, and likely he made a mistake. I reckon that's the way of it. The best way is to let it go and keep still about it. We can spare it." "Oh, shucks, yes, we can spare it. I don't care nothing about that. It's the Count I'm thinking about. We want to be awful square and open and above board here, you know. We want to lug this here money upstairs and count it before everybody. Then there ain't nothing suspicious. But when the dead man says there's $6,000, you know we don't want to—" "Hold on," says the Duke. "Let's make up the deficit." And he begun to haul out yeller boys out of his pocket. "It's a most amazing idea, Duke. You have got a rattling clever head on you," says the king. "Blest if the old Nunsuch ain't a-helping us out again." And he begun to haul out yeller jackets and stack them up. It most busted them, but they made up the 6,000 clean and clear. "Say," says the Duke, "I got another idea. Let's go upstairs and count this money, and then take and give it to the girls." "Good land, Duke, let me hug you. It's the most dazzling idea 'at ever a man struck. You have certainly got the most astonishing head I ever see. Oh, this is the boss dodge, there ain't no mistake about it. Let 'em fetch along their suspicions now if they want to. This'll lay 'em out." When we got upstairs, everybody gathered around the table, and the king he counted it and stacked it up, $300 in a pile, 20 elegant little piles. Everybody looked hungry at it and licked their chops. Then they raked it into the bag again, and I see the king begin to swell himself up for another speech. He says, "Friends all, my poor brother that lays yonder has done generous by them that's left behind in the Vale of Sorrers. He has done generous by these your poor little lambs that he loved and sheltered, and that's left fatherless and motherless. Yes, and we that knowed him knows that he would have done more generous by 'em if he hadn't been afeard of woundin' his dear William and me. Now, wouldn't he? There ain't no question about it in my mind. Well, then, what kind of brothers would it be that'd stand in his way at such a time? And what kind of uncles would it be that'd rob, yes, rob such poor sweet lambs as these that he loved at such a time? If I know William, and I think I do, well, I'll just ask him." He turns around and begins to make a lot of signs to the Duke with his hands, and the Duke he looks at him stupid and leather-headed a while. Then all of a sudden he seems to catch his meaning, and jumps for the king, goo-gooing with all his might for joy, and hugs him about 15 times before he lets up. Then the king says, "I knowed it. I reckon that'll convince anybody the way he feels about it. Here, Mary Jane, Susan, Joanner, take the money. Take it all. It's a gift to him that lays yonder, cold but joyful." Mary Jane she went for him. Susan and the Harelip went for the Duke, and then such another hugging and kissing I never see yet. And everybody crowded up with the tears in their eyes, and most shook the hands off of them frauds, saying all the time, "You dear good souls, how lovely! How could you?" Well, then, pretty soon all hands got to talking about the disease again, and how good he was, and what a loss he was, and all that. And before long, a big iron-jawed man worked himself in there from outside, and stood a-listening and looking, and not saying anything, and nobody saying anything to him either, because the king was talking, and they was all busy listening. The king was saying, in the middle of something he'd started in on, "Them being particular friends of the diseased, that's why they're invited here this evening, but tomorrow we want all to come, everybody, for he respected everybody, he liked everybody, and so it's fitting that his funeral orgies should be public." And so he went on a-mooning on and on, liking to hear himself talk, and every little while he fetching his funeral orgies again, till the Duke he couldn't stand it no more, so he writes on a little scrap of paper, "Obsequies, you old fool," and folds it up and goes to goo-gooing and reaching it over people's heads to him. The king reads it and puts it in his pocket and says, "Poor William, afflicted as he is, his heart's all is right. Asked me to invite everybody to come to the funeral. Wants me to make 'em all welcome. But he needn't 'a' worried, it was just what I was at." Then he weaves along again, perfectly calm, and goes to dropping in his funeral orgies again every now and then, just like he done before. But when he done it the third time, he says, "I say orgies, not because it's the common term, because it ain't, obsequies being the common term, but because orgies is the right term. Obsequies ain't used in England no more now, it's gone out. We say orgies now in England. Orgies is better, because it means the thing you're after more exact. It's a word that's made up out'n the Greek orgo, outside, open, abroad, and the Hebrew jesum, to plant, cover up, hence inter. So, you see, funeral orgies is an open or public funeral." He was the worst I ever struck. Well, the iron-jawed man, he laughed right in his face. Everybody was shocked. Everybody says, "Why, Doctor!" And Abner Shackelford says, "Why, Robinson, hain't you heard the news? This is Harvey Wilkes." The king, he smiled eager, and shoved out his flapper, and says, "Is it my poor brother's dear good friend and physician? "Keep your hands off of me," says the doctor. "You talk like an Englishman, don't you? It's the worst imitation I ever heard. You Peter Wilkes's brother. You're a fraud, that's what you are." Well, how they all took on! They crowded around the doctor and tried to quiet him down, and tried to explain to him and tell him how Harvey showed in 40 ways that he was Harvey, and knowed everybody by name, and the names of the very dogs, and begged him not to hurt Harvey's feelin's, and the poor girl's feelin's, and all that. But it warn't no use. He stormed right along and said any man that pretended to be an Englishman and couldn't imitate the lingo no better than what he did was a fraud and a liar. The poor girls was hanging to the king and crying, and all of a sudden the doctor ups and turns on them. He says, "I was your father's friend, and I'm your friend, and I warn you as a friend and an honest one that wants to protect you and keep you out of harm and trouble, to turn your backs on that scoundrel and have nothing to do with him, the ignorant tramp, with his idiotic Greek and Hebrew, as he calls it. He's the thinnest kind of an impostor. He has come here with a lot of empty names and facts which he picked up somewheres, and you take them for proofs, and are helped to fool yourselves by these foolish friends here, who ought to know better. Mary Jane Wilkes, you know me for your friend, and for your unselfish friend, too. Now listen to me. Turn this pitiful rascal out. I beg you to do it. Will you?" Mary Jane straightened herself up, and my, but she was handsome. She says, "Here is my answer." She hove up the bag of money and put it in the king's hands, and says, "Take the $6,000 and invest for me and my sisters any way you want to, and don't give us no receipt for it." Then she put her arm around the king on one side, and Susan and the hare-lip done the same on the other. Everybody clapped their hands and stomped on the floor like a perfect storm, whilst the king held up his head and smiled proud. The doctor says, "All right, I wash my hands of the matter, but I warn you all that a time's comin' when you're going to feel sick whenever you think of this day." And away he went. "All right, doctor," says the king, kinder mocking him. "We'll try and get him to send for you," which made them all laugh, and they said it was a prime good hit. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Well, when they was all gone, the king, he asked Mary Jane how they was off for spare rooms, and she said she had one spare room which would do for Uncle William, and she'd give her own room to Uncle Harvey, which was a little bigger, and she would turn into the room with her sisters and sleep on a cot, and up garret was a little cubby with a pallet in it. The king said the cubby would do for his valley, meanin' me. So Mary Jane took us up, and she showed them their rooms, which was plain but nice. She said she'd have her frocks and a lot of other traps took out of her room if they was in Uncle Harvey's way, but he said they warn't. The frocks was hung along the wall, and before them was a curtain made out of calico that hung down to the floor. There was an old hair trunk in one corner, and a guitar box in another, and all sorts of little knick-knacks and gimcracks around, like girls brisking up a room with. The king said it was all the more homely and more pleasanter for these fixin's, and so don't disturb them. The Duke's room was pretty small, but plenty good enough, and so was my cubby. That night they had a big supper, and all them men and women was there, and I stood behind the king in the Duke's chairs and waited on them, and the niggers waited on the rest. Mary Jane, she sat at the head of the table, with Susan alongside of her, and said how bad the biscuits was, and how mean the preserves was, and how ornery and tough the fried chickens was, and all that kind of rot, the way women always do for to force out compliments, and the people all knowed everything was tip-top, and said so. Said, how do you get the biscuits to brown so nice? And, where for the land's sake did you get these amazing pickles? And all that kind of humbug talky-talk, just the way people always does at a supper, you know. And when it was all done, me and the hare-lip had supper in the kitchen off of the leavin's, whilst the others was helping the niggers clean up the things. The hare-lip, she got to pumping me about England, and blessed if I didn't think the ice was getting mighty thin sometimes. She says, "Did you ever see the king?" "Who, William IV? Well, I bet I have. He goes to our church." I knowed he was dead years ago, but I never let on. So when I says he goes to our church, she says, "What, regular?" "Yes, regular. His pew's right over opposite ourn, on the other side the pulpit." "I thought he lived in London." "Well, he does. Where would he live?" "But I thought you lived in Sheffield." I see I was up a stump. I had to let on to get choked with a chicken bone so as to get time to think how to get down again. Then I says, "I mean he goes to our church regular when he's in Sheffield. That's only in the summertime when he comes there to take the sea baths." "Why, how you talk! Sheffield ain't on the sea." "Well, who said it was?" "Why, you did." "I didn't nuther." "You did." "I didn't." "You did." "I never said nothing of the kind." "Well, what did you say then?" "Said he come to take the sea baths. That's what I said." "Well, then, how's he going to take the sea baths if it ain't on the sea?" "Looky here," I says, "did you ever see any Congress water?" "Yes." "Well, did you have to go to Congress to get it?" "Why, no." "Well, neither does William IV have to go to the sea to get a sea bath." "How does he get it, then?" "Gets it the way people down here gets Congress water, in barrels. There in the palace at Sheffield, they've got furnaces, and he wants his water hot. They can't buy all that amount of water away off there at the sea. They haven't got no conveniences for it." "Oh, I see now. You might have said that in the first place and saved time." When she said that, I see I was out of the woods again, and so I was comfortable and glad. Next she says, "Do you go to church, too?" "Yes, regular." "Where do you sit?" "Why, in our pew." "Whose pew?" "Why, ourn, your Uncle Harvey's." "His'n? What does he want with a pew?" "Wants it to sit in." "What do you reckon he wanted with it?" "Why, I thought he'd be in the pulpit." "Rot him, I forgot he was a preacher. I see he was up a stump again, so I played another chicken bone and got another think. Then I says, "Blame it, do you suppose there ain't but one preacher to a church?" "Why, what do they want with more?" "What, to preach before a king? I never did see such a girl as you. They don't have no less than 17. 17? My land! Why, I wouldn't set out such a string as that, not if I never got to glory. It must take 'em a week." "Shucks, they don't all of 'em preach the same day, only one of 'em." "Well, then, what does the rest of 'em do?" "Oh, nothing much. Loll around, pass the plate, and one thing or another, but mainly they don't do nothing." "Well, then, what are they for?" "Why, they're for style. Don't you know nothing?" Well, I don't want to know no such foolishness as that. How are servants treated in England? Do they treat 'em better'n we treat our niggers? No, a servant ain't nobody there. They treat 'em worse'n dogs. Don't they give 'em holidays the way we do, Christmas and New Year's week and 4th of July? Oh, just listen. A body could tell you hain't ever been to England by that. Why, Joanna, they never see a holiday from year's end to year's end. Never go to the circus nor theatre, nor nigger shows, nor nowheres. Nor church? Nor church. But you always went to church. Well, I was gone up again. I forgot I was the old man's servant. But next minute I whirled in on a kind of an explanation how a valley was different from a common servant, and had to go to church whether he wanted to or not, and set with the family, on account of its being the law. But I didn't do it pretty good, and when I got done, I see she warn't satisfied. She says, "Honest Injun, now, hain't you been telling me a lot of lies?" "Honest Injun," says I. "None of it at all?" "None of it at all, not a lie in it," says I. "Lay your hand on this book and say it." I see it warn't nothing but a dictionary, so I laid my hand on it and said it. So then she looked a little better satisfied and says, "Well, then, I'll believe some of it, but I hope to be gracious if I'll believe the rest." "What is it you won't believe, Joe?" says Mary Jane, stepping in with Susan behind her. "It ain't right nor kind for you to talk so to him, and him a stranger and so far from his people. How would you like to be treated so?" "That's always your way, Mame, always sailin' in to help somebody before they're hurt. I hain't done nothin' to him. He stole some stretchers, I reckon, and I said I wouldn't swallow it all, and that's every bit and grain I did say. I reckon he can stand a little thing like that, can he?" "I don't care whether 'twas little or whether 'twas big. He's here in our house and a stranger, and it wasn't good of you to say it. If you was in his place it would make you feel ashamed, and so you oughtn't to say a thing to another person that will make them feel ashamed." "Why, Mame, he said—" "It don't make no difference what he said. That ain't the thing. The thing is for you to treat him kind, and not be saying things to make him remember he ain't in his own country, and 'mongst his own folks." I says to myself, this is a girl that I'm letting that old reptile rob her of her money. Then Susan, she waltzed in, and if you'll believe me, she did give Harelip hark from the tomb. Says I to myself, and this is another one that I'm letting him rob her of her money. Then Mary Jane, she took another innin', and went in sweet and lovely again, which was her way, but when she got done, there warn't hardly anything left of poor Harelip, so she hollered. "All right, then," says the other girls, "you just ask his pardon." She done it, too, and she done it beautiful. She done it so beautiful it was good to hear, and I wished I could tell her 1,000 lies, so she could do it again. I says to myself, this is another one that I'm letting him rob her of her money, and when she got through, they all just laid theirselves to make me feel at home, and know I was amongst friends. I felt so ornery and low down and mean that I says to myself, my mind's made up. I'll hive that money for them or bust. So then I lit out. For bed, I said, meanin' some time or another. When I got by myself, I went to thinkin' the thing over. I says to myself, shall I go to that doctor private and blow on these frauds? No, that won't do. He might tell who told him. Then the king and the duke would make it warm for me. Shall I go private and tell Mary Jane? No, I dasn't do it. Her face would give them a hint, sure. They've got the money, and they'd slide right out and get away with it. If she was to fetch in and help, I'd get mixed up in the business before it was done with, I judge. No, there ain't no good way but one. I got to steal that money somehow, and I got to steal it some way that they won't suspicion that I done it. They've got a good thing here, and they ain't a-goin' to leave till they've played this family and this town for all they're worth. So I'll find a chance time enough. I'll steal it and hide it, and by, when I'm away down the river, I'll write a letter and tell Mary Jane where it's hid. But I better hive it tonight if I can, because the doctor maybe hasn't lit up as much as he lets on he has. He might scare them out of here yet. So, thinks I, I'll go and search them rooms. Upstairs the hall was dark, but I found the Duke's room and started to paw around it with my hands, but I recollected it wouldn't be much like the king to let anybody else take care of that money but his own self. So then I went to his room and begun to paw around there. But I see I couldn't do nothing without a candle, and I dasn't light one, of course. So I judged I've got to do the other thing, lay for them and eavesdrop. About that time I hears their footsteps comin', and was going to skip under the bed. I reached for it, but it wasn't where I thought it would be. But I touched the curtain that hid Mary Jane's frocks, so I jumped in behind that and snuggled in amongst the gowns, and stood there perfectly still. They come in and shut the door, and the first thing the Duke done was to get down and look under the bed. Then I was glad I hadn't found the bed when I wanted it. And yet, you know, it's kind of natural to hide under the bed when you are up to anything private. They sits down then, and the king says, "Well, what is it? And cut it middlin' short, because it's better for us to be down there a-whoopin' up the mornin' than up here giving them a chance to talk us over." "Well, this is it, Capet. I ain't easy. I ain't comfortable. That doctor lays on my mind. I wanted to know your plans. I've got a notion, and I think it's a sound one." "What is it, Duke?" "That we better glide out of this before 3 in the mornin', and clip it down the river with what we've got, 'specially seeing we got it so easy, given back to us, flung at our heads, as you may say, when of course we allowed to have to steal it back. I'm for knocking off and lighting out." That made me feel pretty bad. About an hour or two ago it would have been a little different, but now it made me feel bad and disappointed. The king rips out and says, "What? And that sell out the rest of the property? March off like a passel of fools and leave $8,000 or $9,000 worth of property laying around, just sufferin' to be scooped in? And all good saleable stuff, too?" The Duke, he grumbled, said the bag of gold was enough, and he didn't want to go no deeper. Didn't want to rob a lot of orphans of everything they had. "Why, how you talk," says the king. "We shan't rob them of nothing at all but just this money. The people that buys the property is the sufferers, because as soon as it's found out that we didn't own it, which won't be long after we've slid, the sale won't be valid, and it'll all go back to the estate. These your orphans will get their house back again, and that's enough for them. They're young and spry, and can easy earn a living. They ain't a-going to suffer. Why, just think, there's thousands and thousands that ain't nigh so well off. Bless you, they ain't got nothing to complain of." Well, the king, he talked him blind, so at last he give in, and said all right, but said he believed it was blamed foolishness to stay, and that doctor hanging over them. But the king says, "Cuss the doctor, what do we care for him? Ain't we got all the fools in town on our side? And ain't that a big enough majority in any town?" So they got ready to go downstairs again. The Duke says, "I don't think we put that money in a good place." That cheered me up. I'd begun to think I weren't going to get a hint of no kind to help me. The king says, "Why?" "Because Mary Jane'll be in mourning from this out, and first you know, the nigger that does up the rooms will get an order to box these duds up and put 'em away. And do you reckon a nigger can run across money and not borrow some of it?" "Your head's level again, Duke," says the king, and he comes a-fumbling under the curtain 2 or 3 foot from where I was. I stuck tight to the wall and kept mighty still, though quivery, and I wondered what them fellers would say if they catched me, and I tried to think what I'd better do if they did catch me. But the king, he got the bag before I could think more than about a half a thought, and he never suspicioned I was around. They took and shoved the bag through a rip in the straw tick that was under the feather bed, and crammed it in a foot or 2 amongst the straw, and said it was all right now, because a nigger only makes up the feather bed, and don't turn over the straw tick only 'bout twice a year, and so it warn't in no danger of getting stole now. But I knowed better. I had it out of there before they was halfway downstairs. I groped along up to my cubby and hid it there till I could get a chance to do better. I judged I better hide it outside of the house somewheres, 'cause if they missed it, they would give the house a good ransacking. I knowed that very well. Then I turned in, with my clothes all on, but I couldn't have gone to sleep if I'd wanted to, I was in such a sweat to get through with the business. By and by I heard the king and the duke come up, so I rolled off my pallet and laid with my chin at the top of my ladder and waited to see if anything was going to happen, but nothing did. So I held on till all the late sounds had quit and the early ones hadn't begun yet, and then I slipped down the ladder. End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27. I crept to their doors and listened. They was snoring, so I tiptoed along and got downstairs all right. There warn't a sound anywheres. I peeped through a crack of the dining-room door and see the men that was watching the corpse all sound asleep on their chairs. The door was open into the parlor, where the corpse was layin', and there was a candle in both rooms. I passed along, and the parlor door was open, but I see there warn't nobody in there but the remainders of Peter, so I shoved on by, but the front door was locked, and the key wasn't there. Just then I heard somebody comin' down the stairs back behind me. I run in the parlor and took a swift look around, and the only place I see to hide the bag was in the coffin. The lid was shoved along about a foot, showin' the dead man's face down in there with a wet cloth over it, and his shroud on. I tucked the money bag in under the lid, just down beyond where his hands was crossed, which made me creep, they was so cold. And then I run back across the room and in behind the door. The person comin' was Mary Jane. She went to the coffin very soft and kneeled down and looked in. Then she put up her handkerchief, and I see she begun to cry, though I couldn't hear her, and her back was to me. I slid out, and as I passed the dining-room, I thought I'd make sure them watchers hadn't seen me, so I looked through the crack, and everything was all right. They hadn't stirred. I slipped up to bed, feelin' ruther blue, on accounts of the thing playin' out that way after I had took so much trouble and run so much resk about it. Says I, if it could stay where it is, all right, 'cause when we get down the river 100 mile or two, I could write back to Mary Jane, and she could dig him up again and get it. But that ain't the thing that's going to happen. The thing that's going to happen is, the money'll be found when they come to screw on the lid. Then the king'll get it again, and it'll be a long day before he gives anybody another chance to smouch it from him. Of course I wanted to slide down and get it out of there, but I dasn't try it. Every minute it was getting earlier now, and pretty soon some of them watchers would begin to stir, and I might get catched with $6,000 in my hands that nobody hadn't hired me to take care of. I don't wish to be mixed up in no such business as that, I says to myself. When I got downstairs in the morning, the parlor was shut up, and the watchers was gone. There warn't nobody around but the family and the widow Bartley in our tribe. I watched their faces to see if anything had been happening, but I couldn't tell. Towards the middle of the day, the undertaker come with his man, and they set the coffin in the middle of the room on a couple of chairs, and then set all our chairs in a row, and borrowed more from the neighbors, till the hall and the parlor and the dining-room was full. I see the coffin lid was the way it was before, but I dasn't go to look in under it with folks around. Then the people begun to flock in, and the Beats and the girl took seats in the front row at the head of the coffin, and for half an hour the people filed around slow in single rank, and looked down at the dead man's face a minute, and some dropped in a tear, and it was all very still and solemn, only the girls and the Beats holding handkerchiefs to their eyes and keeping their heads bent and sobbing a little. There warn't no other sound but the scraping of the feet on the floor and blowing noses, 'cause people always blows them more at a funeral than they do at other places, except church. When the place was packed full, the undertaker, he slid around in his black gloves with his softy, sootherin' ways, puttin' on the last touches, and gettin' people and things all ship-shape and comfortable, and makin' no more sound than a cat. He never spoke. He moved people around, he squeezed in late ones, he opened up passageways and done it with nods and signs with his hands. Then he took his place over against the wall. He was the softest, glidin'est, stealthiest man I ever see, and there warn't no more smile to him than there is to a ham. They had borrowed a melodeon, a sick one, and when everything was ready a young woman set down and worked it, and it was pretty screaky and colicky, and everybody joined in and sung, and Peter was the only one that had a good thing, according to my notion. Then the Reverend Hobson opened up, slow and solemn, and begun to talk, and straight off the most outrageous row busted out in the cellar a body ever heard. It was only one dog, but he made a most powerful racket, and he kept it up right along. The parson, he had to stand there over the coffin and wait. You couldn't hear yourself think. It was right down awkward, and nobody didn't seem to know what to do. For pretty soon they see that long-legged undertaker make a sign to the preacher, as much as to say, "Don't you worry, just depend on me." Then he stooped down and begun to glide along the wall, just his shoulders showing over the people's heads. So he glided along, and the powwow and racket getting more and more outrageous all the time. And at last, when he had gone around 2 sides of the room, he disappears down cellar. Then in about 2 seconds we heard a whack, and the dog he finished up with a most amazin' howl or two, and then everything was dead still, and the parson begun his solemn talk where he left off. In a minute or two here comes this undertaker's back and shoulders glidin' along the wall again, and so he glided and glided around 3 sides of the room, and then rose up and shaded his mouth with his hands and stretched his neck out towards the preacher over the people's heads, and says in a kind of a coarse whisper, "He had a rat." Then he drooped down and glided along the wall again to his place. You could see it was a great satisfaction to the people, because naturally they wanted to know. A little thing like that don't cost nothing, and it's just the little things that makes a man to be looked up to and liked. There warn't no more popular man in town than what that undertaker was. Well, the funeral sermon was very good, but pizen long and tiresome. And then the king, he shoved in and got off some of his usual rubbage, and at last the job was through, and the undertaker begun to sneak up on the coffin with his screwdriver. I was in a sweat then, and watched him pretty keen, but he never meddled at all, just slid the lid along as soft as mush, and screwed it down tight and fast. So there I was. I didn't know whether the money was in there or not. So, says I, suppose somebody has hogged that bag on the sly. Now how do I know whether to write to Mary Jane or not? S'pose she dug him up and didn't find nothing. What would she think of me? Blame it, I says, I might get hunted up and jailed. I'd better lay low and keep dark, and not write at all. The thing's awful mixed now. Trying to better it, I've worsened it 100 times, and I wish to goodness I'd just let it alone. Dad fetched the whole business. They buried him, and we come back home, and I went to watching faces again. I couldn't help it, and I couldn't rest easy. But nothing come of it. The faces didn't tell me nothing. The king, he visited around in the evening and sweetened everybody up, and made himself ever so friendly, and he give out the idea that his congregation over in England would be in a sweat about him, so he must hurry and settle up the estate right away and leave for home. He was very sorry he was so pushed, and so was everybody. They wished he could stay longer, but they said they could see it couldn't be done. And he said of course him and William would take the girls home with them, and that pleased everybody too, because then the girls would be well fixed, and amongst their own relations. And it pleased the girls too, tickled them so they clean forgot they ever had a trouble in the world, and told him to sell out as quick as he wanted to. They would be ready. Them poor things was that glad and happy it made my heart ache to see them getting fooled and lied to so, but I didn't see no safe way for me to chip in and change the general tune. Well, blamed if the king didn't bill the house and the niggers and all the property for auction straight off. Sale 2 days after the funeral, but anybody could buy private beforehand if they wanted to. So the next day after the funeral, long about noontime, the girls' joy got the first jolt. A couple of nigger traders come along, and the king sold them the niggers reasonable, for 3 days' drafts, as they called it, and away they went, the 2 sons up the river to Memphis, and their mother down the river to Orleans. I thought them poor girls and them niggers would break their hearts for grief. They cried around each other, and took on so, it most made me down sick to see it. The girls said they had never dreamed of seeing the family separated or sold away from the town. I can't ever get it out of my memory, the sight of them poor miserable girls and niggers hanging around each other's necks and crying, and I reckon I couldn't have stood it at all, but would have had to bust out and tell on our gang, if I hadn't knowed the sale weren't no account, and the niggers would be back home in a week or 2. The thing made a big stir in the town, too, and a good many come out flat-footed and said it was scandalous to separate the mother and the children that way. It injured the frauds some, but the old fool, he bulled right along, spite of all the Duke could say or do, and I tell you the Duke was powerful uneasy. Next day was auction day. About broad day in the morning the Duke and the king come up in the garret and woke me up, and I see by their look that there was trouble. The king says, "Was you in my room night before last?" "No, your majesty," which was the way I always called him when nobody but our gang warn't around. "Was you in there yisterday or last night?" "No, your majesty." "Honor bright now, no lies." "Honor bright, your majesty, I'm telling you the truth. I hain't been anear your room since Miss Mary Jane took you and the Duke and showed it to you." The Duke says, "Have you seen anybody else go in there?" "No, your grace, not as I remember, I believe." "Stop and think." I studied a while and see my chance. Then I says, "Well, I see the niggers go in there several times." Both of them gave a little jump and looked like they hadn't ever expected it, and then like they had. Then the Duke says, "What, all of them?" "No, leastways not all at once, that is. I don't think I ever saw them all come out at once, but just one time." "Hullo! When was that?" "It was the day we had the funeral, in the morning. It warn't early because I overslept. I was just starting down the ladder and I see them." "Well, go on. Go on. What did they do? How'd they act?" "They didn't do nothin', and they didn't act anyway much, as fur as I can see. They tiptoed away, so I seen easy enough that they'd shoved in there to do up your majesty's room or something, s'posin' you was up, and found you warn't up, and so they was hopin' to slide out of the way of trouble without waking you up, if they hadn't already waked you up." "Great guns, this is a go!" says the king, and both of them looked pretty sick and tolerable silly. They stood there a-thinkin' and scratchin' their heads a minute, and the Duke he bust into a kind of a little raspy chuckle, and says, "It does beat all, how neat the niggers played their hand. They let on to be sorry they was goin' out of this region, and I believe they was sorry, and so did you, and so did everybody. Don't ever tell me any more that a nigger ain't got no histrionic talent. Why, the way they played that thing, it would fool anybody. In my opinion, there's a fortune in 'em. If I had capital and a theater, I wouldn't want a better layout than that. And here we've gone and sold 'em for a song. Yes, and ain't privileged to sing the song yet. Say, where is that song, that draft?" "In the bank to be collected. Where would it be?" Well, that's all right then. Thank goodness. Says I, kind of timid-like, is something gone wrong? The king whirls on me and rips out, None of your business. You keep your head shut and mind your own affairs if you got any. Long as you're in this town, don't you forget that, you hear? Then he says to the Duke, We got to just swaller it and say nothin'. Mum's the word for us. As they was startin' down the ladder, the Duke, he chuckles again and says, Quick sales and small profits. It's a good business, yes. The king snarls around on him and says, I was trying to do for the best in sellin' 'em out so quick. If the profits had turned out to be none, lacking considerable, and none to carry, is it my fault any more'n it's yourn? Well, they'd be in this house yet, and we wouldn't, if I could 'a' got my advice listened to. The king sassed back as much as was safe for him, and then swapped around and lit into me again. He give me down the banks for not comin' and tellin' him I see the niggers comin' out of his room actin' that way. Said any fool would 'a' knowed somethin' was up. And then waltzed in and cussed himself a while, and said it all come of him not layin' late and takin' his natural rest that mornin', and he'd be blamed if he'd ever do it again. So they went off a-jawin', and I felt dreadful glad I'd worked it all off on the niggers, and yet hadn't done the niggers no harm by it. End of Chapter 27. Chapter 28. By and by it was gettin' up time, so I come down the ladder and started for downstairs, but as I come to the girl's room the door was open, and I see Mary Jane settin' by her old hair trunk, which was open and she'd been packin' things in it, gettin' ready to go to England. But she had stopped now with the folded gown in her lap and had her face in her hands, cryin'. I felt awful bad to see it. Of course anybody would. I went in there and says, Miss Mary Jane, you can't a-bear to see people in trouble, and I can't, most always. Tell me about it. So she done it, and it was the niggers. I just expected it. She said the beautiful trip to England was most about spoiled for her. She didn't know how she was ever goin' to be happy there, knowin' the mother and the children warn't ever goin' to see each other no more. And then busted out bitterer than ever, and flung up her hands and says, Oh, dear, dear, to think they ain't ever goin' to see each other any more. But they will, and inside of 2 weeks, and I know it, says I. Laws, it was out before I could think, and before I could budge, she throws her arms around my neck and told me to say it again, say it again, say it again. I see I had spoke too sudden and said too much and was in a close place. I asked her to let me think a minute, and she set there, very impatient and excited and handsome, but looking kind of happy and eased up, like a person that's had a tooth pulled out. So I went to studying it out. I says to myself, I reckon a body that ups and tells the truth when he's in a tight place has taken considerable many risks, though I ain't had no experience and can't say for certain, but it looks so to me anyway. And yet here's a case where I'm blessed if it didn't look to me like the truth is better and actually safer than a lie. I must lay it by in my mind and think it over some time or other. It's so kind of strange and unregular. I never see nothing like it. Well, I says to myself at last, I'm a-goin' to chance it. I'll up and tell the truth this time, though it does seem most like settin' down on a kag of powder and touchin' it off just to see where you'll go to. Then I says, Miss Mary Jane, is there any place out of town a little ways where you could go and stay 3 or 4 days? Yes, Mr. Lothrop's. Why? Never mind why yet. If I'll tell you how I know the niggers will see each other again inside of 2 weeks, here in this house, and prove how I know it, will you go to Mr. Lothrop's and stay 4 days? 4 days? She says. I'll stay a year. All right, I says. I don't want nothing more out of you than just your word. I'd druther have it than another man's kiss the Bible. She smiled and reddened up very sweet, and I says, If you don't mind it, I'll shut the door, and bolt it. Then I come back and set down and says, Don't you holler. Just set still and take it like a man. I got to tell the truth, and you want to brace up, Miss Mary, 'cause it's a bad kind, and going to be hard to take, but there ain't no help for it. These uncles of yourn ain't no uncles at all. They're a couple of frauds, regular deadbeats. There, now we're over the worst of it, you can stand the rest middlin' easy. It jolted her up like everything, of course, but I was over the shoal water now, so I went right along, her eyes a-blazin' higher and higher all the time, and told her every blame thing, from where we first struck that young fool goin' up to the steamboat, clear through to where she flung herself on to the king's breast at the front door, and he kissed her 16 or 17 times. And then up she jumps with her face afire like sunset and says, The brute! Come, don't waste a minute, not a second. We'll have them tarred and feathered and flung in the river. Says I, Certainly, but do you mean before you go to Mr. Lothrop's, or— Oh, she says, What am I thinking about? She says, and set right down again. Don't mind what I said, please don't. You won't, now, will you? Laying her silky hand on mine in that kind of a way that I said I would die first. I never thought I was so stirred up, she says. Now go on, and I won't do so any more. You tell me what to do, and whatever you say, I'll do it. Well, I says, it's a rough gang, them two frauds, and I'm fixed so I got to travel with them a while longer, whether I want to or not. I'd druther not tell you why, and if you was to blow on them, this town will get me out of their claws, and I'd be all right, but there'd be another person that you don't know about who'd be in big trouble. Well, we got to save him, hain't we? Of course. Well, then, we won't blow on them. Sayin' them words put a good idea in my head. I see how maybe I could get me and Jim rid of the frauds, get them jailed here, and then leave. But I didn't want to run the raft in the daytime without anybody aboard to answer questions but me, so I didn't want the plan to begin working till pretty late tonight. I says, Miss Mary Jane, I'll tell you what we'll do, and you won't have to stay at Mr. Lothrop's so long, nother. How far is it? A little short of 4 miles, right out in the country back here. Well, that'll answer. Now you go 'long out there and lay low till 9 or half-past tonight, and then get them to fetch you home again. Tell them you've thought of something. If you get here before 11, put a candle in this window, and if I don't turn up, wait till 11, and then if I don't turn up, it means I'm gone and out of the way and safe. Then you come out and spread the news around and get these beats jailed. Good, she says, I'll do it. And if it just happens so that I don't get away, but get took up along with them, you must up and say I told you the whole thing beforehand, and you must stand by me all you can. Stand by you, indeed I will. They shan't touch a hair of your head, she says, and I see her nostrils spread and her eyes snap when she said it, too. If I get away, I shan't be here, I says, to prove these rapscallions ain't your uncles, and I couldn't do it if I was here. I could swear they was beats and bummers, that's all, though that's worth something. Well, there's others can do that better than what I can, and they're people that ain't going to be doubted as quick as I'd be. I'll tell you how to find them. Give me a pencil and a piece of paper. There, Royal Nonsuch, Bricksville. Put it away and don't lose it. When the court wants to find out something about these two, let them send up to Bricksville and say they've got the men that played the Royal Nonsuch, and ask for some witnesses. Why, you'll have that entire town down here before you can hardly wink, Miss Mary, and they'll come a-bilin', too. I judged we had got everything fixed about right now, so I says, just let the auction go right along and don't worry. Nobody don't have to pay for the things they buy till a whole day after the auction, on accounts of the short notice, and they ain't going out of this till they get that money, and the way we fixed it, The sale ain't going to count, and they ain't going to get no money. It's just like the way it was with the niggers. There warn't no sale, and the niggers will be back before long. Why, they can't collect the money for the niggers yet. They're in the worst kind of a fix, Miss Mary. Well, she says, I'll run down to breakfast now, and then I'll start straight for Mr. Lothrop's. "'Deed, that ain't the ticket, Miss Mary Jane," I says. "By no manner of means. Go before breakfast." "Why? What did you reckon I wanted you to go at all for, Miss Mary?" "Well, I never thought, and come to think I don't know. What was it?" "Why, it's because you ain't one of these leather-faced people. I don't want no better book than what your face is. A body can sit down and read it off like coarse print. Do you reckon you can go and face your uncles when they come to kiss you good morning and never—" "There, don't!" "Yes, I'll go before breakfast. I'll be glad to." "And leave my sisters with them?" "Yes, never mind about them. They've got to stand it yet a while. They might suspicion something if all of you was to go. I don't want you to see them, nor your sisters, nor nobody in this town. If a neighbor was to ask how was your uncles this morning, your face would tell something. No, you go right along, Miss Mary Jane, and I'll fix it with all of them. I'll tell Miss Susan to give your love to your uncles and say you've went away for a few hours to get a little rest and change, or to see a friend, and you'll be back tonight or early in the morning." "Gone to see a friend is all right, but I won't have my love given to them." "Well, then, it shan't be." It was well enough to tell her so, no harm in it. It was only a little thing to do, and no trouble, and it's the little things that smooths people's roads the most. Down here below, it would make Mary Jane comfortable, and it wouldn't cost nothing. Then I says, "There's one more thing, that bag of money." "Well, they've got that, and it makes me feel pretty silly to think how they got it." "No, you're out there. They hain't got it." "Why, who's got it?" "I wish I knowed, but I don't. I had it because I stole it from them, and I stole it to give to you, and I know where I hid it, but I'm afraid it ain't there no more. I'm awful sorry, Miss Mary Jane. I'm just as sorry as I can be, but I done the best I could. I did, honest. I come nigh getting caught, and I had to shove it into the first place I come to and run, and it warn't a good place." "Oh, stop blaming yourself. It's too bad to do it, and I won't allow it. You couldn't help it if it wasn't your fault. Where did you hide it?" I didn't want to set her to thinking about her troubles again, and I couldn't seem to get my mouth to tell her what would make her see that corpse layin' in the coffin with that bag of money on his stomach. So for a minute I didn't say nothing. Then I says, "I'd druther not tell you where I put it, Miss Mary Jane, if you don't mind letting me off, but I'll write it for you on a piece of paper, and you can read it along the road to Mr. Lothrop's if you want to. Do you reckon that'll do?" "Oh, yes." So I wrote, "I put it in the coffin. I was in there when you was crying there away in the night. I was behind the door, and I was mighty sorry for you, Miss Mary Jane." It made my eyes water a little to remember her crying there all by herself in the night, and them devils layin' there right under her own roof, shaming her and robbing her, and when I folded it up and give it to her, I see the water come into her eyes too, and she shook me by the hand hard, and says, "Good-bye. I'm going to do everything just as you've told me, and if I don't ever see you again, I shan't ever forget you, and I'll think of you a many and a many a time, and I'll pray for you, too." And she was gone. Pray for me? I reckoned if she knowed me, she'd take a job that was more nearer her size. I bet she done it just the same. She was just that kind. She had the grit to pray for Judas if she took the notion. There warn't no back down to her, I judge. You may say what you want to, but in my opinion, she had more sand in her than any girl I ever see. In my opinion, she was just full of sand. It sounds like flattery, but it ain't no flattery. And when it comes to beauty, and goodness too, she lays over them all. I hain't ever seen her since that time that I see her go out of that door, No, I hain't ever seen her since. But I reckon I've thought of her a many and a many a million times, and of her saying she would pray for me. And if ever I'd a thought it would do any good for me to pray for her, blamed if I wouldn't have done it or bust. Well, Mary Jane, she lit out the back way, I reckon, because nobody see her go. When I struck Susan in the hare-lip, I says, "What's the name of them people over on the other side of the river that you all goes to see sometimes?" They says, "There's several, but the Proctors mainly." "That's the name," I says. "I most forgot it. Well, Miss Mary Jane, she told me to tell you she's gone over there in a dreadful hurry. One of them's sick." "Which one?" "I don't know, leastways I kinder forget, but I think it's—" "Sakes alive, I hope it ain't Hanner." "I'm sorry to say it," I says, "but Hanner's the very one." "My goodness! And she's so well only last week. Is she took bad?" "It ain't no name for it. They set up with her all night, Miss Mary Jane said, and they don't think she'll last many hours." "Only think of that! Now! What's the matter with her?" I couldn't think of anything reasonable right off that way, so I says, "Mumps." "Mumps your granny! They don't set up with people that's got the mumps." "They don't they? You better bet they do with these mumps. These mumps is different. It's a new kind, Miss Mary Jane said." "How's it a new kind?" "Because it's mixed up with other things." "What other things?" "Well, measles and whooping cough and erysipelas and consumption and yaller janders and brain fever and I don't know what all." "My land! And they call it the mumps?" "That's what Miss Mary Jane said." "Well, what in the nation do they call it the mumps for?" "Why, because it is the mumps. That's what it starts with." "Well, there ain't no sense in it. A body might stump his toe and take poison and fall down the well and break his neck and bust his brains out, and somebody come along and ask what killed him, and some numbskull up and say, 'Why, he stumped his toe.' Would there be any sense in that? No. And there ain't no sense in this, nuther. Is it ketchin'?" "Is it ketchin'? Why, how you talk! Is a harrow ketchin' in the dark? If you don't hitch onto one tooth, you're bound to on another, ain't you? And you can't get away with that tooth without fetching the whole harrow along, can you? Well, these kind of mumps is a kind of a harrow, as you may say, and it ain't no slouch of a harrow, nuther. You come to get it hitched on good." "Well, it's awful, I think," said the hare-lip. "I'll go to Uncle Harvey and—" "Oh, yes," I says, "I would. Of course I would. I wouldn't lose no time." "Well, why wouldn't you?" "Just look at it a minute and maybe you can see. Hain't your uncles obleeged to get along home to England as fast as they can? And do you reckon they'd be mean enough to go off and leave you to go all that journey by yourselves? You know they'll wait for you. So fur so good. Your Uncle Harvey's a preacher, ain't he? Very well, then. Is a preacher going to deceive a steamboat clerk? Is he going to deceive a ship clerk, so as to get them to let Miss Mary Jane go aboard? Now you know he ain't. What will he do then? Why, he'll say, 'It's a great pity, but my church matters has got to get along the best they can, for my niece has been exposed to the dreadful pluribus unum mumps, and so it's my bounden duty to set down here and wait the 3 months it takes to show on her if she's got it. But never mind, if you think it's best to tell your Uncle Harvey—" "Shucks, and stay fooling around here when we could all be having a good time in England, whilst we was waiting to find out whether Mary Jane's got it or not? Why, you talk like a muggins." "Well, anyway, maybe you'd better tell some of the neighbors." "Listen at that, now. You do beat all for natural stupidness. Can't you see that they'd go and tell? There ain't no way but just not to tell anybody at all." "Well, maybe you're right. Yes, I judge you are right. But I reckon we ought to tell Uncle Harvey she's gone out for a while anyway, so he won't be uneasy about her. Yes, Miss Mary Jane, she wanted you to do that. She says, 'Tell them to give Uncle Harvey and William my love and a kiss, and say I've run over the river to see Mr.' What is the name of that rich family your Uncle Peter used to think so much of? I mean the one why, you must mean the Apthorps, ain't it? Of course, bother them kind of names. Abida can't ever seem to remember them, half the time, somehow. Yes, she say she is run over to ask the Apthorps to be sure and come to the auction and buy this house, because she allowed her Uncle Peter would rather they had it than anybody else, and she's going to stick to them till they say they'll come, and then, if she ain't too tired, she's coming home, and if she is, she'll be home in the morning anyway. She said don't say nothing about the Proctors, but only about the Apthorps, which'll be perfectly true because she is going there to speak about their buying the house. I know it because she told me so herself. All right, they said, and cleared out to lay for their uncles and give them the love and the kisses and tell them the message. Everything was all right now. The girls wouldn't say nothing because they wanted to go to England, and the king and the duke would rather Mary Jane was off working for the auction than around in reach of Dr. Robinson. I felt very good. I judged I had done it pretty neat. I reckon Tom Sawyer couldn't have done it no neater himself. Of course, he would have throwed more style into it, but I can't do that very handy, not being brung up to it. Well, they held the auction in the public square along towards the end of the afternoon, and it strung along, and the old man he was on hand, and looking his level poisonest, up there alongside of the auctioneer, and chipping in a little scripture now and then, or a little goody-goody saying of some kind, and the duke, he was around goo-gooing for sympathy, all he knowed how, and just spreading himself generally. But by and by the thing dragged through and everything was sold, everything but a little old trifling lot in the graveyard. So they'd got to work that off. I never see such a graft as the king was for wanting to swallow everything. Well, whilst they was at it, a steamboat landed, and in about 2 minutes up comes a crowd a-whooping and yelling and laughing and carrying on, and singing out, "Here's your opposition line! Here's your 2 sets of heirs to old Peter Wilkes, and you pays your money and you takes your choice." End of chapter 28.